Welcome, I'm Jon Caldara, president of the Independence Institute and your devil's advocate. A little later in the program, a look at the fashion show that's most important in Colorado, and we'll tell you why. But first, Senator Pat Steadman from the Colorado State Senate. Glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Jon.
Got a few things I want to talk to you about, but first let's talk pot. You are leading, You're leading the charge to keep our pot taxes. Explain first of all how we got into this situation, and then let's tussle a little bit on why you guys should keep our tax revenues.
So this year we're in a situation where we're looking at a Tabor refund of the entire first year's tax collection of the new marijuana taxes that voters approved with Proposition AA in 2013.
Now, just to get through the technicalities, we passed something called Amendment 64, which legalized recreational pot. It allowed you guys to set some tax rates. You set those tax rates.
Well, it directed us to do that. I mean, the voters told us, we're legalizing it, but you figure out how to regulate it and you figure out how to tax it. And the legislature did that.
Right, but you guys hit the higher level of taxation on this, I would say.
Well, we set the excise tax at the 15% maximum in the Constitution, and even then, it's not generating the $40 million that the Constitution sort of promised to the school construction program. Yeah.
But, all right, so, and with AA, we gave you permission to tax pot, which wasn't a big fight because we said go ahead and make it legal.
Right.
Now, there's a refund coming thanks to the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. This is good news.
Well, some people may look at it that way. I think it flies in the face of voters' intention because voters just told us by a 2-to-1 margin 2 years ago, we want to have marijuana taxed. And yet the entire first year's revenue is now at risk of being refunded when voters told us, collect this tax and spend it on these things. And so
these things being
school construction program specifically, that was in Amendment 64, $40 million to the school construction program.
Which, by the way, what a great bit of what's the opposite of blackmail? It's like, well, give us money for pot and we'll build schools. Not that there's a direct correlation. I mean, I can understand
there's
build prisons, we'll build rehab programs.
There's people in the education world that resent the linkage, you know, and are uncomfortable having any of these conversations because they don't want to get cozy with the marijuana issue, and yet the marijuana issue chose them as their beneficiaries.
This happens in Colorado a lot. The higher ed hooked up with the gaming industry, saying if you raise our limited stakes gaming, we'll put it into community colleges. What one has to do with the other. We've got a tax on tobacco, which goes to build Read to Achieve programs for grade schoolers and sidewalks. Not quite the same thing, but in any event. So the money's not being spent, or will be.
Right. We have escrowed the total amount of collection during the first year, as is required by Tabor. And if voters choose, that money will be refunded to taxpayers next year.
Why does it have to be refunded? Is it because the rest of the budget has hit our Tabor limit?
Yeah, well, this gets complicated. The blue booklet that gets mailed out to every voter every year is required by Tabor to have information in there on tax questions when you have a voter measure that seeks either a new tax or a tax increase. And voters are required to be advised how much is the new tax going to generate in its first year. And they're also required to be informed what is the total amount of state revenue this year that's subject to Tabor. So when Prop AA was on the ballot 2 years ago, we all got our blue books, and it said that the marijuana taxes were going to generate $67 million a year. And for context, you should know that the total amount of state revenue subject to Tabor is $12.08 billion this year. Now that we're through the first year of marijuana taxes, it turns out we collected $66 million, which is below the number in the blue book. We did not exceed the estimate. There's no one was duped about how much this new tax is going to be. But the economists that did the economic forecast, the estimates, which is the word Tabor uses, it's an estimate, they produced that $12.08 billion estimate of state fiscal year revenue subject to Tabor. And they were doing this in the summer of 2013, just as our economy was taking off. And quite frankly, they made a mistake. They didn't anticipate how fast revenue would rebound.
And
because of that, it's all subject to refund.
And this is going to be on a proposition which is on this fall's ballot.
Yes.
It is AA, do I have that right?
Prop BB.
BB, all right, Prop BB. Let me make a prediction. This is going to pass pretty comfortably.
I expect it to look a lot like the vote on AA.
Right. So, you know, I'll be ideological and say, hey, you know, that's more money in government. Let's bring it to the private sector. If it were to fail and it was going to get refunded, How would you in the legislature likely refund it? By lowering
Actually,
pot taxes?
We've already answered that question. The legislation that referred this question to the voters spelled out how we would spend the money if we get to keep it, and how we would make the refund if that's the choice voters make. And there's $66 million to be refunded. We would refund back to the marijuana growers all the excise tax that they paid. We would refund to marijuana purchasers through a temporary sales tax rate reduction, a holiday that would run from sometime in January for some duration of time.
If you're a hardcore pothead, you'll be voting no on this, so the price of your goods go down.
Well, that depends. You know, there's a lot of people that support marijuana legalization that understand that taxation is an important component of regulation and control, of keeping the feds from coming in and shutting it down.
It makes it
and
legitimate.
producing benefits.
Let's take a larger view of this. So step back a few steps. Those in Colorado that are adamantly opposed to legalized pot believe pot is a danger, and I think they've got a lot of good points. I think pot is a danger. However, it's here. Did you think this experiment would go this way? Do you think it's here to stay? Do you think it could be rolled back? I'm talking recreational pot legalization.
You know, we've been very cautious in the legislature about making assumptions about whether or not this is going to be here to stay, as we've been, you know, setting out these policies and starting to spend some of the money from the revenue from the taxes. A year or two ago, I would have said proceed very, very cautiously. But now that we're a year and a half into Amendment 64's, you know, recreational sales, things are going much better, I think, than anybody anticipated. And I'm just watching the mood in the country and what's happening in other states. It seems like we're at the vanguard of a movement, and I don't think there's any turning back. I think it's here to stay.
Tie this into booze for me. I know you've got some ideas, and you want to convince me of a new tax scheme for booze. Now, I don't do pot, but let me tell you, I take my scotch pretty damn seriously. So what are you thinking about?
Well, first off, you should know that Colorado, amongst the 50 states, we rank 46th in our level of alcohol taxation. We're almost at the bottom.
Hot damn.
So if you're a Scotch lover, you picked the right state to do it in. You know, over the past 2 years, I've spent a lot of time working on marijuana taxes. Just when we first got the money coming in, when we had this refund problem, I'm very aware of what we're doing with marijuana tax revenue. And I think there's strong support amongst voters, you know, regardless of how you feel about legalization. I think people like the idea that we have this tax revenue to deal with the consequences.
And the tax revenue, the idea of this, and I think there's some seepage, but the idea is that pot smokers start paying their way more in the social costs. That is, for law enforcement, for treatment, for
I
those
think
type of things.
that's true. And ask yourself, is the same true of alcohol? And I think the answer is no. The reason this really is something I'm become much more adamant about is that for the past couple of years, the legislature's been debating felony DUI offenses for repeat drunken drivers.
Right.
And we finally passed a felony this year. I have been someone that was keeping that from happening the past couple of years, primarily because of the budget impact. In some of the previous versions of felony DUI, you were looking at increasing our prison budget by up to $30 million a year under some of the previous versions of the bill. The one that passed this year, when it is fully implemented here in a couple of years, we're going to see increased prison costs of $9.4 million a year from sending repeat DUI offenders to prison.
All right, bring it to booze.
And there's no plan to pay for it. There's nothing in the budget, and so that money's going to come away from schools.
But as a guy who drinks scotch, and good scotch, I'm not drinking and driving, so I don't know if that's applicable. You know, the holes in my liver, all right, you might have a case, but you know, I'm not the one on
John, I don't think there's
an
argument that there is a higher social cost, societal cost from alcohol abuse than from marijuana. I really don't. When you talk about lost productivity from people calling in sick to work with a hangover, or domestic violence, or bar fights, or and then the healthcare costs, and then traffic and addiction, I think we should be taxing alcohol like we do marijuana. We are using marijuana taxes in this state to try to mitigate some of the social costs and impacts of marijuana legalization. But that is not our approach with alcohol taxes. We have some of the lowest alcohol taxes in the country.
That's a good thing. That's not a bad thing.
And we don't apply those revenues to trying to mitigate some of the known harms and social costs of alcohol.
And by the way, as we said at the beginning, a lot of the pot taxes go to things that have nothing to do with pot. You know, it was a buy-off for schools.
School construction, yeah. I can't make the nexus for you there.
I'm here to.
But what we're doing,
I'm here to help the construction of schools. No, that one doesn't work.
Tax. There's also sales tax on pot, and we are using that for prevention, education,
understand my
treatment.
My wallet doesn't understand the difference between an excise tax and a sales tax. It's all pulled together. Now, I understand the idea that these taxes should be more like a fee, that if there's a social cost for pot, this is going to help mitigate that. If there's rehab costs, here we do it. And you're saying let's do the same thing with booze. That's not a bad point. Why not use the money that is already being used on pot, or excuse me, booze, and redirect it to those areas, to say that taxes on alcohol go into a fund for rehab, for enforcement.
We just made a commitment to $9.5 million worth of new prison costs each year that we weren't paying previously. There's no money that we were using previously. That's going to come out of something in the budget. I think it should be coming out of increases in alcohol excise taxes. I think we should be using that money to do more prevention and intervention work so people don't get to a situation where they've had a 4th DUI and are looking at prison time. I think we can save traffic fatalities, make our roads safer, make a real impact in people's lives by taking a more proactive, preventative approach. And to do that requires a little new revenue and some different emphasis in how we approach problem drinkers.
I think you're going to have a harder sell with this, in that the pot industry, being in its infancy, wanted to be legitimized. They wanted to be able to say, hey, we're a real business. Go ahead and tax us and regulate us. That way the chances of the feds coming in and shutting us down go down. Booze has been around forever. But
the industry probably still doesn't like us talking about alcohol-related traffic fatalities. They probably don't like hearing about the number of domestic violence incidents on Super Bowl Sunday. I think there's some PR here that the alcohol industry should be aware of.
Half a minute. What level do you want to tax it? And is this going to come up in this year?
Remains to be seen. Not in 15, talking about 16 at this point. That remains to be seen. I'm just floating the idea, but I'm pointing out the fact that we do not tax the two things alike, even though the Constitution tells us to regulate them alike, and that for just a little bit more money, we could cover the prison costs of felony DUI and have some resources to direct more into prevention and mitigation efforts.
There would be some sort of single malt carve-out on this plan.
We'd have to negotiate that.
Pat, thank you. Stay tuned.